So community's trophic structure, it represents the passage of energy and nutrients from plants, which are photosynthetic or autotrophic, to herbivores initially, and then on upwards to predators. And how many predators are in a particular community depends on that particular community and how it's put together and what organisms are there. So, a food chain represents a simplified, unrealistic sequence of food transfer between trophic levels, starting with the base, the producers. If it's a terrestrial food chain, it's the plants. If it's the aquatic food chain, it's the autotrophic organisms like phytoplankton or protists, algae, or even cyanobacteria. Okay? And then something is going to consume the producers, and those are the first level of consumers called the primary consumers. Herbivores on land and zooplankton in water. Someone's going to eat the primary consumers, and those are the secondary consumers. And there are carnivores on land or on water. And then there may be a tertiary consumer, a higher level carnivore that's going to eat that secondary consumer. And then there may be a fourth level quaternary consumer. And often these are the top predators in a particular environment. So this is showing a linear sequence of energy transfer called a food chain. In real life, it's much more complicated than this. So producers are the autotrophic organisms, photosynthetic organisms, and that's a trophic level that supports all of the other higher trophic levels. That's the base of the food chain. And then the heterotrophs, hetero meaning different, the heterotrophs are the consumers. And so this is all the organisms in the trophic levels above the producers. So herbivores are the primary consumers. Higher trophic levels are made up of carnivores. A secondary consumer, so this two not means secondary. So the secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. Then the tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers. And the fourth level quaternary consumers, if there's any around, will eat the tertiary consumers, and so forth. And an omnivore is any animal that will eat producers and consumers at different levels. So omni meaning multiple in this case. What is not shown here is organisms that specialize in eating dead things and or decomposing things, the decomposers and detritivores, and we'll get to those soon enough. So here we go. Some consumers get energy from detritus, dead material. So these are the detritivores. One level or one category are the scavengers. They feed on carcasses, dead things like crows and or vultures. So they don't kill things outright. They're looking for dead animals to take advantage. They scavenge, right? So they're scavengers. Detritivores are primarily consuming decaying organic material. Think of like earthworms in a compost bin or in the soil, or things like millipedes. And they specialize in eating detritus. And then the decomposers, they digest molecules in organic material and then convert that organic material after they process it into inorganic forms. And these are prokaryotes like bacteria and fungus, which are the primary decomposers in our environment. And they help break down things all the way down to the molecular level, releasing gases, but also releasing organic material into inorganic forms that's then available, like in the soil, for things to grow. Part of the nutrient cycling of organic material into inorganic material. So let's talk a little bit about biological magnification. So toxins, pollutions can become concentrated as they pass up through a food chain in a process that's called biological magnification, meaning they concentrate in organisms as we go up in the hierarchy levels of the feeding chains or food chains. So for example, biological magnification in toxic PCBs, a nasty chemical in the Great Lakes food chain, is represented by this figure. So concentration in PBCs goes up in the trophic levels. If we look at the phytoplankton, the base of the food chain in a lake, the levels are pretty darn small, 0.025 parts per million. That's ppm. Don't worry about that so much, but notice the number, 0.025. And that is smaller than 0.125 and also smaller than 1.0. So as things feed on the phytoplankton, like the zooplankton or small fish, the toxins that accumulate in the phytoplankton build up in concentration in these consumers. And then, so these would be primary consumers. Secondary consumers are eating these guys, and those toxins built up in concentration in their tissues up to 4.8 parts per million. And then a tertiary level consumer, the parts per million would build up to the 0.124 parts per million, where now the toxins have serious detrimental effects on those organisms and on their eggs. So the toxic effects might not be seen at the lower trophic levels because the concentrations aren't quite high enough. The picture here shows eggshell damage. The eggshells don't form when DDT, which is a pesticide that's not used anymore in the United States because it was banned, but it did the same thing. It got magnified through biological magnification up the food chain in a similar fashion as PCBs, I mean. And this shows a peregrine falcon egg that was misformed, not forming properly, so the chick would not hatch. Peregrine falcon numbers started to drop. And then importantly, or equally, American bald eagle population numbers started to drop. So that was a bad thing for the states back in the 1970s because, well, the bald eagles are our national symbol, and it would be really sad if our national symbol went extinct. So there was a move to ban DDT, and as the concentrations in organisms dropped because this was no longer produced into the environment, the peregrine falcon numbers and American bald eagle numbers went back up and rebounded, and they are essentially safe at this point. Okay, let's get into a more realistic view of energy flow through an ecosystem via food webs. So the earlier food chain was simplified, but it gives you a sense of how energy moves through an ecosystem via producers to consumers up through the top level consumers, but it's highly simplified. A food web is much more realistic, where you have still producers and primary consumers and secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumers, but the multiple lines indicate the multiple interactions and transfer of energy between producers and the different levels of the consumers. Basically, who's eating who and the energy transfer that occurs because of that. So food webs are interwoven feeding relationships in a community. So again, this is much more realistic versus a food chain. Okay, let's move on to species diversity in communities. So species diversity, that's the variety of different species that make up a particular community, but it's measured in a couple of ways. One way is species richness, meaning the different numbers of species in a community. And if we look at this example of a community 1 versus a community 2, the species richness, the number of different species, is the same. 4 different species in this community, 4 different species in community 2. But if you look at the distribution of these species, that's not the same because the relative abundance is different. So the relative abundance is the relative numbers of each species in a community, or the relative proportion of them. So if we look at community 1, it's considered much more even because each species actually is equally represented 25%. In community 2, notice that this particular species is dominating, and these other two are not very common, and this one here is actually fairly rare. So community 2 is not quite as even in terms of relative abundance. So we can think of it as having a lower species diversity. So relative abundance of one species in woodland A is higher than in woodland B. This is out of your textbook, actually. Than the relative abundance of the other 3 species. So let me repeat that. So the relative abundance of one species in woodland A is higher than the relative abundance of the other 3 species. So notice in woodland A, this fairly round canopy species is much more abundant, 80% of the species represented in woodland A. But in woodland B, in that community, that's the teal bars here, it's much more even. In fact, it looks like they're all 25%. So plants provide food and shelter for many different animals. So a diverse plant community like in woodland B, community B, will tend to promote more or a higher animal diversity. So it's actually considered a healthier community versus community A. Community A might be healthy, but it most likely will have a lower animal diversity, different types of animals, than community B. And because of that, also community B would be considered to be more resistant to change, environmental change, versus community A. Okay, let's move on to an example of an organism that has a really important effect on a community structure, and this is considered, or this is the keystone species. So it's a species whose impact on the community is much higher, much more significant than its actual abundance would indicate, or its actual numbers would indicate. And actually, it could be somewhat rare in its community. So experiments in the 60s demonstrated that the sea star is a keystone species in the intertidal zones of the Washington coast, and actually this is common in the rocky intertidal zone almost worldwide. This slow-moving, harmless to us sea star is actually a voracious predator where it lives. And it is so important that with the removal of the sea stars, or if the numbers really drop down, the community structure becomes very simplified and dominated by mussels, these type of relative to a clam, and it totally overgrows the rock and outcompetes other mollusks that would be living there because it's a really good competitor. The presence of the sea star, which eats mussels, which are somewhat abundant, keeps the mussel numbers down or low enough to allow other organisms to survive. So in a way, the keystone species in this particular environment kind of evens things out and keeps the community healthy in the sense of keeping a relatively high species diversity in the intertidal zone. Again, with the removal of this organism, the complexity changes and becomes much more simplified, and the mussel dominates. So because of that, it's considered a keystone species. Another example, the sea otter. Its declines along the coasts of Alaska and California allowed the population of its favorite food item, the sea urchin, to erupt. Well, what the sea urchin likes to eat are the algae, the kelp, and especially their holdfasts on the rock. So with the high abundance of sea urchins, because the sea otter's populations dropped due to hunting, the sea urchin population numbers exploded and they decimated the kelp beds, and the kelp beds offer protection and habitat for many, many fish in the coastal